Don't waste your money on this MacBook.
Huh? Does this person not like the new MacBook Pro?
Oh no, it's just a little clickbait, you know? The M1 Max is overkill and most prosumers only need an M1 Pro anyways.
I don't believe you.
Hey, Danny with the DMGT here. I just wanted to have a little bit of fun with the intro because, oh my god, there's so much clickbait around these new MacBooks, it's crazy. Most of it is actually pretty good content and I'm watching it. I understand the point they're trying to make, but still. Anyways, this review took me a little bit longer than I had anticipated because I just wanted to make sure I got it right. Especially since this is going to be from a perspective of someone upgrading from something like a 2016 MacBook Pro, which is what I'm doing. I actually touched on that point a couple of times in some previous videos and the 2016 MacBook Pro Revisited video a couple years ago, and in my initial impressions video for this MacBook. So a little over a month since these bad boys launched, here's my full review of the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Are they actually overkill? Let's get some specs out of the way before we continue. My machine is a 14-inch model upgraded to the 24-core, 10-core M1 Max. So that's actually 2 tiers above the base M1 Pro. I have 32 gigabytes of shared RAM, and I stayed at the base 500 gigabyte SSD. I probably could have and maybe should have upgraded to a 1 terabyte hard drive, but I use external hard drives for most of my content creation anyways. Something I've always felt was missing in a lot of reviews is how much of an impact the average person is going to feel when they finally upgrade, right? Like, most of us aren't upgrading every single year, even if you are a pro user, and we're certainly not testing every iteration of a device as it's released. Don't get me wrong, that type of content and review cycle is important for improvements year over year and providing that quick feedback for new things that are implemented and introduced. But with that type of review cycle, you start losing a little bit of the context of the value of what it's like upgrading from a 2016 MacBook Pro to a 2021 MacBook Pro, which is about the average life cycle of a laptop in general, about 5 years. I checked. So without getting too far ahead of myself in this review, let me tell you, this MacBook Pro is probably my favorite tech purchase of all time, like period. Better than any TV upgrade, any gaming console, any headphones. Like, this machine is the real deal. So on top of that baseline perspective, I'm going to try to keep this compact, but this is going to be a little bit of a longer video, so there are going to be 3 primary topics I'm going to be talking about. Overall performance in your day-to-day and real-world applications, media production, which will include video and audio production, and gaming. Yes, gaming. I'll elaborate on that in that section. So here are some general highlights that I'm sure you're probably already aware of before I fully dunk on the 2016 MacBook Pro. These new MacBook Pros are hefty, but in all the best possible ways. It's got feet at the bottom to help with airflow. They're only actually a little bit thicker than the Touch Bar MacBook Pros, which is put to perfect use to bring us that mini LED display and that longer battery life. And how could I forget? It has ports. Ports. No, but seriously, I fully adopted USB-C in 2016, and any adapter I got was more to increase the available ports rather than compatibility, since I replaced most of my cables with USB-C compatible ones, like an HDMI to USB-C that I use for my monitor directly to my laptop. You know what? Maybe it was a little bit of copium back then, but I gotta say, having HDMI back, MagSafe, the SD card slot is just so much better to have back on a Pro device. It's just way easier if in a pinch you need to plug into a TV or a monitor somewhere else on the go, and to quickly pop in an SD card from my GoPro, I mean, you'd still need an adapter for that. It's just convenience that honestly, it should have never left in the first place. Now, it would have been nice to see HDMI 2.1 support, since a big case I'm making in this video is how future-proof I think these will be. Even if there aren't a ton of monitors and TVs that are running 4K at 120 Hz via the HDMI port. I know DisplayPort can do it, relax. So Apple does lose some points here. Look, I don't want to beat a dead horse here since so many reviews have already done it, but quite frankly, these ports should have never left a Pro device. So while they're good to have back, Apple cannot and will not receive any praise from me.
He's already dead.
It's the absolute bare minimum, but hey, at least they're here now. Trackpad, still great, still large, still the best trackpad on any laptop out there. The keyboard is not perfect, but very much serviceable even during longer sessions with acceptable travel distance on each key. And I actually really like the black recessed keyboard area, although that's been a little bit hit or miss for some people. I'll admit, I fell into the crowd that actually enjoyed the touch bar. It was nice to tweak settings when I was producing music or buffering through videos, but it never really reached its full potential, so bringing back the function keys was the correct move. And at least we're keeping keeping Touch ID in the power button. As for the display, man, that mini LED display is really nice. It's so incredibly close to OLED that in real world day-to-day application, most people would be straight up lying if they could tell you they could see any discernible difference between the two. It's super pretty to consume HDR content on, and the color accuracy is phenomenal for you photo and video editors out there. I'll expand on that piece in the media production section. Yes, the top notch is super dumb and way too big. The curved top corner is actually cut out a few pixels, but you really don't notice it after the first initial impression. Overall, you still do get an effective 16:10 viewing area, since the notch is basically just cutting into that top section that is basically only reserved for the top taskbar. Now, the 16-inch model does give you a little bit closer to a 4K resolution. It's not quite there yet, and the 14-inch model is a little bit more in between, kind of like a 3K resolution. I'll admit it's actually a little bit confusing because if you pull up a YouTube video in 4K, it says 4K, but it's not actually rendering it in 4K. Just the way that the scaling works is very good. Still, it's an incredible display even if it's not a full proper 4K resolution. Now, the audio output is something I was super interested in, especially after the initial wave of impressions and reports. The speakers are very high quality. You have crisp highs, decently rounded out mids, and a surprising depth to the low end. Now, you get the full effect when they're on a flat surface, just the way that the acoustics are built with the chassis and the speakers themselves. So they do mellow out a little bit if you have the laptop lifted onto like a stand or on your lap. Honestly, they hold up super well, and they'll probably outperform some low and maybe even some mid-tier Bluetooth speakers. When it comes to that quick media consumption, they're pretty good, and for laptop speakers, they definitely overachieve. The headphone port, however, I'm not quite as high on. So Apple was claiming that you could drive high impedance headphones and wouldn't need an amplifier or external DAC. But was that actually true? I mean, kind of, but not really. Look, this is a tricky part of the video to put into layman's terms because the moment that I do, some audio file is going to be in my comments with 4 paragraphs of text that I'm just not going to read. But feel free to do that. That's going to help with the engagement on this video. So what does that actually mean? Apple boasted that they could drive high impedance headphones. Basically, they're headphones that require a little bit more voltage for you to get the full and proper audio from those headphones. Higher end headphones tend to require a little bit more juice. If you're really interested in learning about audiophile gear and headphones, leave a like, drop a comment, subscribe, all that good jazz. I enjoy distilling down scary sounding topics to more consumer friendly terms. All right, where am I going with this? So that type of claim is really meant to appeal to audio enthusiasts, which is why it's weird that they claimed it in the first place, because those of us in that niche honestly tend to be a little more, let's say, fastidious. You like that one? Basically just means pretentious. I just wanted to use that word in the script, okay? Yeah, I mean, I'm including myself in there because it's kind of true. Literally, one of the first things I did when this laptop came in was grab my Hi-Fi Men 4XX planar magnetic headphones, which are headphones that notoriously need a lot of power to drive. Planar magnetic headphones use magnets to move a thin film of metal to displace air, and that's technically how you get sound. Anyways, yeah, the port drove it better than my 2016 MacBook Pro, but that's not really saying a lot, so don't throw away that amplifier. You're still gonna need one. I applaud the effort, and the internal sound card on this machine is definitely better than basically anything you'll get on a stock laptop or motherboard anywhere else. But to claim that you wouldn't need an amplifier was definitely a reach. In an emergency, like if you're working from a cafe or you're traveling and for some reason you brought along your high-end headphones, then sure, it'll work. But I'm calling the bluff. Apple definitely stretched the claim. It's a good headphone port, but you still need that amplifier. On to battery life in real-world scenarios. On the 14-inch model, I'm gonna admit you are gonna sacrifice a little bit of battery life compared to the 16-inch model, but I really wanted to go with something a little bit more portable, and I don't regret it at all. Even with the more powerful M1 Max chip on this machine, I don't have any complaints. Depending on the workload I have on any given day, it'll fluctuate, but I'm looking at anywhere from 10 to 12 hours of battery life on light to medium light usage. So on days that I'm scripting or researching, ideating, watching some YouTube videos here and there, I get that solid amount of battery life. And then on more heavy usage days that I'm doing stuff like video editing, photo editing, making some music, you know, the things that people looking into this machine are probably going to do. Like, let's say you're really pushing the laptop full throttle nonstop, then yeah, around the 4-hour to 6-hour mark, you're gonna need to plug into power, which is still pretty good in my opinion. I could go half a day at a cafe or on my couch, and by then I need a break anyways, and it's not an inconvenience to go find a power outlet. And that's if I find myself doing those full-on heavy tasks on the go. Compare that then to my 2016 MacBook Pro, and honestly, honestly, we're cutting a lot of those numbers right in half. You could give or take 1 or 2 hours depending on the workload, but honestly, when I was editing a full YouTube video, I'm out of juice in 3 hours. Actually, some of the benchmarking I did for this video on the 14-inch MacBook Pro, I did over single sessions, and that battery lasted me maybe 7 or 8 hours. So that's plenty of battery life for me at that type of workload, and that extra thickness is definitely put to good use, and it really speaks to the power efficiency of these new chips. I haven't really spoken about the chips that much because they really shine in the context of the purposes of this machine. So let's do that. Here's the thing, Apple has always been very good at optimizing their hardware to their software. So even the 2016 MacBook Pro, when it comes to Final Cut, can still beat out Premiere or DaVinci Resolve on newer Windows machines. That's always been one of the Mac's biggest strengths, and where you can start making a real argument for its price points. I mean, spend your money however you want, right? But when you're watching reviews for a new laptop, it's best to be informed and honest with your own needs. But man, I gotta say, when you are video editing, producing music, doing those creative production functions on these laptops, Macs have always been able to hang with the heavyweights in those departments. And this is where the new machines with the M1 Pro and the M1 Max start truly setting themselves apart and are seriously in a class of their own. There used to be this caveat that you had to switch over to Final Cut Pro or Logic Pro to take full advantage of that hardware and software integration that Apple is so well known for. And while there is still some of that to get the full potential of the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, a lot of those non-Apple products such as your Adobe Premieres have been updated to better take advantage of Apple Silicon. You'll notice that I haven't really talked that much about synthetic benchmarks because one, there's already a ton of content on that on the internet, so you don't really need me to do it. And two, they're honestly just becoming numbers at this point. And the way that Apple has built these new chips is kind of changing the way that the industry is viewing performance beyond just raw clock speed and CUDA cores. So you start looking at real world performance, and even on those non-Apple products like Adobe Premiere, the M1 Pro and M1 Max are wiping the floor with any laptop in its tier or even in higher tiers. That Razer Blade 15 Advanced model runs you $2,300 with the i7-11800H and RTX 3060, and the Ryzen 5900HX with the 3070 runs you $2,800. Sure, those are more geared towards gaming with their super high refresh rate displays, but they're still CPUs and GPUs you'd be realistically using for these media production functions. And they fall short of even the base M1 Pro that runs you around $2,000. Granted, mine is bumped up to the 10-core CPU, 24-core GPU M1 Max, and that's closer to $2,900, but all that means is the gap gets even bigger. So I decided to do a simple, quick export of a video from my iPhone 13 Pro Max. A 2-minute 4K ProRes video that I then color graded on all three machines using my 14-inch M1 Max laptop, my 2016 MacBook Pro with a 4-core i7 2.7 GHz CPU, and an AMD Radeon Pro 460, 4GB of both RAM and VRAM, and then even compared it to my gaming PC, which has an 8-core i7 9700K with a base clock of 3.6 GHz, turbo boosts up to 4.9 GHz, 32GB of RAM, and a Gigabyte 2800 Super Overclocked Edition with 8GB of VRAM. Both Macs are on Final Cut, and I did use DaVinci Resolve on my PC because it's free. This isn't a perfect experiment by any means, but most people don't have access to 3 different machines with an Adobe Premiere subscription, so this just gives you a better idea of what it's like to upgrade if you're looking for a new laptop in this range. So here are the export results. Again, of 2-minute 4K ProRes clip at 30 frames per second into H.264. My 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max, 50 seconds with no discernible battery loss, maybe 2 or 3%. The 2016 MacBook Pro took 1 minute and 27 seconds, but it did lose around 10% battery life. And then my PC using DaVinci Resolve, 2 minutes and 45 seconds. All of these were at medium quality, so they generated about a file size of 1GB. I honestly wasn't really expecting the 2016 MacBook Pro to beat out the PC, even if it is on Resolve. And while these results aren't exponential on longer projects with a bunch of different clips, it does start painting a picture of how my experience has been on the new Mac. Playback and timeline buffering on both my gaming PC and M1 Max is still silky smooth, but when the projects start getting larger, particularly with 4K video, the M1 Max starts running away. A few hiccups here and there didn't stop me from creating content and making videos on my 2016 MacBook Pro, but as I wanted to expand my own skills as a video editor, the 2016 MacBook Pro was just starting to chug along and struggle to keep up, whereas on the new M1 Max, I can throw pretty much anything added and it handles it like a champ. No hiccups whatsoever. With the 2016 MacBook Pro, I really had to think about how I was going to edit so I didn't experience any crashes, and it was just no longer a pleasant editing experience if I needed to wait 3 to 5 seconds every time I wanted to cut and paste a clip into the timeline. Not to mention the display on the new MacBooks are insane. If you want to create HDR content, this is the way to go. Even just on the color accuracy side of things, I would bet that the display on these laptops are better than whatever monitor you have at home, even if you are a pro in some cases. I still prefer using my 27-inch 4K monitor for the timeline editing and things like that, but I actually do the video playback and video monitoring on the laptop for color grading and such. It's just a little easier to fine-tune settings to my liking. I mentioned it in my first impressions video, but it's truly a display that you just need to experience yourself. So head over to an Apple store if you have one near you and really experience it in person because it's a really nice display. The only thing that comes even close to comparing this display is my LG OLED TV, and that's an OLED. Ultimately, export time and editing time is much faster on this 14-inch laptop, and if this is your actual job, time saved is money saved, so over time there is no question that this new MacBook Pro is the superior choice. And then for you musicians and producers out there, the story is a little bit different here, but not in a bad way. There is a little bit of a diminishing returns since CPU performance and bandwidth is more important for music production than GPU performance is. So realistically, if you only care about music production, you're gonna be safe going with an M1 Pro. That isn't to say that I regret getting an M1 Max, because as someone who does both video editing and some music production, it's just the perfect solution for me. And on top of that, I really enjoy knowing that I have a bunch of future performance headroom. Still, the experience from my old laptop to this one is also night and day. Once I start pushing even 15 to 20 tracks and throw on some plugins on top of that, my 2016 MacBook Pro would just start chugging along. Even if I had fewer tracks and I was doing a longer session, like when I'm recording my podcast, which by the way, you should go listen and check out the DMGT podcast I run with Spencer. It wasn't uncommon for my computer to crash in the middle of a recording session, which is always a bummer. So now that's peace of mind on top of the better performance for production. So for example, there's a reason why the Montero project is available to download on Logic, besides the obvious spatial audio that Apple keeps trying to push. 140 tracks, vocal plugins, spatial audio, guitar plugins, drum plugins. That project is no joke. I can barely even load it on my 2016 MacBook Pro, and if I expand all the tracks at once, it just starts crapping out. So is it overkill? Maybe, but since when is that a bad thing? Unfortunately, if you're running on something like ProTools, it's still running through Rosetta and only on macOS Monterey, so you can't really take full advantage of the M1 chips. But on the flip side, fortunately, it still performs super well. I'm not a Pro Tools user, but plenty of videos out there show the high buffer usage, and the M1 chips seem to do a good job of distributing the workload across all their cores. The only thing I would caution towards is plugin compatibility. There's a lot of plugins out there that still need to be updated even a year later to Apple Silicon, so just something to keep in mind if you are a Pro Tools user. The point being, this machine is an absolute beast when it comes to music production, and you're not going to regret it at all. Finally, let's touch on gaming, because there are a couple of things that I'm sure some of you have noticed I haven't talked about yet. Thermals and fan noise. Before I go in, let me make something very crystal clear. Do not buy this MacBook for gaming. You can game on these machines, but this is the one area that you should absolutely not buy this machine for. Everything else, even at lower price points, will outperform these Macs when it comes to gaming if you're trying to get into the portable PC, laptop gaming world. Improved gaming performance is more of an indirect result of these new Apple Silicon chips. However, the nice part is if you do find yourself at the gaming niche and you're looking at this machine for all the other things I mentioned in this video, gaming on this laptop isn't actually as insane as it sounds. If gaming on a Nintendo Switch is an acceptable experience with the 720p and 30 FPS, then gaming on these Macs is definitely an acceptable experience as well. Again, as a result of getting this laptop for the other needs, I feel the need to repeat myself because I can already hear some of you talking about the cost difference in the comments. So then, how does the M1 Max with the 24-core GPU perform? Surprisingly well. Like, I'm talking real 1440p at 60 FPS using medium settings. Depends on the title, give or take here and there. And yeah, the game library is limited on Steam using Max, but A classic example like Shadow of the Tomb Raider is very much playable. If you care about graphical fidelity, you can even crank the settings all the way up and you still get a solid, consistent 30 FPS. This is no longer a bare bones gaming experience on a Mac. This is actual gaming. Of course, the price to performance ratio is horrible, but like I've been saying, if you're on the go and need a quick kick, or if you have to choose a high-end production laptop over a gaming PC, then you have some real gaming flexibility now as well. Most games do still run on Rosetta, but I tested Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Civilization 6, Pillars of Eternity, Hollow Knight, Northgard, a personal favorite. Most of these games will give you a solid 30 to 60 FPS on high settings depending on the resolution that you set, but even 720p was a struggle to get 30 FPS from my 2016 MacBook Pro, so this is a huge improvement in gaming performance. I wouldn't even think about playing games on my 2016 MacBook Pro, and now I actually have some installed. But guess what? I downloaded some games onto the 2016 MacBook Pro anyways for this review because we can finally talk about thermals and fan noise. The power efficiency on these M1 Pro and M1 Max chips is incredible. Sure, this 14-inch MacBook Pro would feel a little warm to the touch when I was doing some intense video editing, but I never really heard the fans spin up compared to my 2016 MacBook Pro where even just music production, everything was already at full throttle. So when I finally did spin up Shadow of the Tomb Raider and then Civilization 6 for some more CPU intensive benchmarking, I was really surprised at the performance of the M1 Max. The fans do start kicking in, but you can barely even hear them and it doesn't really get that much warmer to touch. They do warm up, but nowhere near the uncomfortable levels that MacBook Pros have experienced in recent years, which is crazy considering the load that they're under while gaming. I mean, listen to the difference yourself. Can't hear the fans. Can't hear the fans. The ambient noise in my room is actually louder than the fans on my 14-inch MacBook Pro, whereas on the 2016 MacBook Pro, I'm approaching PS4 levels of fan noise. And that in a nutshell gives you a snapshot of what my experience has been like upgrading from that 2016 MacBook Pro to the M1 Max on this 14-inch model. The 2016 fans were always kicked up and I can barely hear the fans on the 14-inch model, which means that I know that I have headroom in the future, and not even just on the gaming side of things. Besides, if you really are in a pinch and want to game, Xbox Game Pass works super well in a browser. Again, don't buy this for gaming, but it can game. So, in conclusion, are you wasting your money if you go with an M1 Max over an M1 Pro? I don't know, are you wasting your money when you buy an RTX 3090 when you can still have a negative KD ratio playing the same game on your Switch? Sorry, that one was a little aggressive. No, I don't think you're wasting your money. I think it's money well spent if you have the budget for it. On the flip side, what this means is that you shouldn't feel bad if you can only afford the M1 Pro. It's going to service your needs fully. Hell, even a MacBook Air running a base M1 chip will still give you the performance you need, even if you want to do a little bit of 4K video editing. I try to keep my cool right in this review and actually try to bring up some negatives because someone's always ready to call someone an Apple shill. But I don't care. This laptop is super cool and I don't regret buying it at all. If you want to go off technicalities, then sure, it's a little bit of overkill, but go big or go home, right? It's just an overall super pleasant experience to use, even if I'm not cranking it to the max in video editing or gaming or doing music production. Everything about this laptop, from listening to music to web browsing to watching YouTube videos, just feels a little bit better. Obviously, those aren't really objective things you can bring up in a tech review, but sometimes all the specs are there and the experience isn't quite as nice when it comes to technology. So it's just super nice to actually have that experience. Yeah, this is a very expensive machine built for very specific use cases and scenarios, but if you think that you're going to get some benefit from it, you will, and I highly recommend it. If you haven't guessed by now, this is definitely my top pick for tech of the year, laptop of the year. It's that good. Anyways, thanks for being patient for the review on this video. I'm going to be reviewing Halo Infinite next, so keep an eye out for that this week, and then I have all the top 10 things of games, tech, and music coming up the week after. So subscribe, stay tuned, and I'll catch you next time.